public engagement team advocates to the rest of the United States and makes the case for why Ukraine's victory is in the interest of Americans.
What we were able to clearly advocate for was that American leadership abroad is putting America first, and that it is good to lead and to support Ukraine and to support others around the world.
We have people who are vulnerable to Russian propaganda and who believe that, Russia is the bastion of conservative values, and they think that, we need to make sure that this kind of space continues to thrive.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. And I'm your host, Myroslava Yaremkin. Razom Advocacy is one of the initiatives of the public organization Razom for Ukraine, dedicated to promoting Ukraine's political success and fostering community engagement in the United States and Ukraine. Its representatives volunteer alongside experts, politicians, and voters to support the development of a more democratic and prosperous Ukraine. Activists operate within Congress, the White House, and the executive branch to advance policies that strengthen Ukraine, ensure its success, and amplify Ukrainian-American voices in political discourse. The coalition coordinates various grassroots organizations across America that support Ukraine. In today's episode, we will discuss how to effectively communicate Ukraine's interests to American politicians and ensure bipartisan support for Ukraine among Americans. If you want to learn more about this subject, please continue watching this video and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss our videos in the future. Razom for Ukraine, the same as Ukraine Crisis Media Center, was born out of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. When millions of people worked together and risked their lives to build a pathway to a better future for Ukraine. Those who were unable to be in Ukraine during this time wanted to do their part to help the movement as best as they could from abroad. Many sent funds and supplies to sustain the community built on the Maidan through the winter, but they also took it to the streets in their own cities to raise awareness and amplify voices from Ukraine in the West. In New York, a handful of the organizers and participants of those activities decided to form an organization that could help sustain momentum and propel forward the important work started on the Maidan. They named it Razom, which means together in Ukrainian, and serves as a constant reminder of the community that it takes to create, build, and do to stay the path towards a more prosperous and democratic Ukraine. Klain, policy analyst for Razom for Ukraine, will talk more about it.
Razom for Ukraine started 10 years ago in 2014. It was started by Ukrainian-Americans in New York City, watching the Euromaidan and saying, this is an opportunity for a better future for Ukraine. We have to help. And Razom started taking mostly humanitarian and medical assistance to Ukraine. It was an excellent, scrappy nonprofit. It had maybe a couple $100,000 a year getting aid over to Ukraine. But in 2022, with the full-scale invasion, all of a sudden, Razom became a very different thing. It was one of the go-to organizations in the United States for Americans that wanted to donate to assist Ukraine. And Razom's budget got a lot bigger. Much of this aid still comes directly into Ukraine. Our primary work is humanitarian and medical assistance, as well as training and first aid programs. But after 2022, one thing that Razom for Ukraine did was create an advocacy team to work full-time in Washington, D.C. Razom still gets aid to Ukraine, but we make sure that the United States gets aid to Ukraine and gives Ukraine what it needs to win. We have two teams, a government affairs team, which Greg and I are on, and we have a public engagement team. Our government affairs team advocates to the U.S. government, to Congress, to the executive branch, the White House, and we push for policy changes to ensure that legislation such as the recently passed supplemental aid bill that passed in April from Congress, things like this happen, and Ukraine continues to get critical life-saving support. Our public engagement team advocates to the rest of the United States and makes the case for why Ukraine's victory is in the interest of Americans. So we just spent 8 months advocating in Washington, D.C. for the passage of this supplemental aid bill, and we got a pretty good understanding of what's going on in Washington, of how politics around support for Ukraine are changing, and important lessons for how to maintain support for Ukraine in the United States. And so we've spent this week here in Kyiv sharing these lessons and learning from people here to take good information back to Washington to help us do our job.
The events in Israel have undoubtedly diverted the world's attention from the war in Ukraine. It is also important that the West was beginning to feel fatigue from the Russian-Ukrainian war, and this also played a role in this matter. Thus, a number of countries that previously supported Ukraine, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, have accused the collective West of double standards, in particular because the West actively responded to the deaths of civilians in Ukraine due to the Russian invasion, but did not condemn Israel's actions against the Palestinians. At the same time, representatives of the Ukrainian authorities actively condemned the action of Hamas, but with regard to Israel's attacks on the Gaza Strip, they limited themselves to careful statements about the need to protect civilians. Kulchyckyj, Associate Director of Government Affairs and Strategy at Razom for Ukraine, will share with us how the situation in Israel affects Ukrainian advocacy.
I think it's fair to say that when President Biden put in his supplemental request in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, it seemed wise at the time. This idea that an urgent reaction was needed from Congress, not just for Ukraine aid, but also for Israel aid. That binding evolved in a unique way over the course of this funding campaign for 6+ months. And so it ended up being successful because at the end of the day, there was this large package in April that wasn't just Ukraine aid. It included Israel aid. It included aid for Taiwan and the region. It also included the passage of the Repo Act. So it was a large bundle of priorities. And so in that sense, President Biden was able to successfully pushed that through and was able to work with Congress to get it done, although it did take longer. That said, I don't think that connection between the Middle East and what's happening here in Ukraine was a factor in the speed of its passage. I think that there was just a lot of disinformation in Washington, D.C. in terms of what it means to put America first, what it means to support countries abroad. And what we were able to clearly advocate for was that American leadership abroad is putting America first, and that it is good to lead and to support Ukraine and to support others around the world. And then to go further, unless either of my colleagues would like to add, I would say that how the U.S. government approaches Israel and Ukraine are completely agnostic of each other. They are two very different conflicts, two extremely different historical contexts. And I think it would be wise for all of us to focus only on the theater here in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
In the vast majority of cases, those advocating for Ukraine's interests are U.S. citizens. This enables them to approach their representatives in power and discuss what support Ukraine needs, focusing on various issues such as financial aid, increasing weapon supplies, training Ukrainian pilots on the F-16, and intensifying sanctions against Russia. This includes addressing the genocide in Ukraine and transferring frozen Russian assets to aid in Ukraine's reconstruction. The advocacy of Ukraine's interests by the Razom for Ukraine is an exceptionally challenging yet crucial process that ensures Ukraine receives necessary assistance. Director of Advocacy at Razom for Ukraine, Murskyj, will talk more about how they overcome arguments against aiding Ukraine.
There are generally two categories of arguments that people make against assisting Ukraine. There are bad faith arguments and there are good faith arguments. There are many more bad faith arguments that we hear on Capitol Hill and in the American public. Many people don't understand what's going on in Ukraine, and that's because they aren't interested in international affairs. They have some kind of existing predisposition to not trusting mainstream media. There's various reasons why somebody doesn't understand how important it is that Ukraine win. But going back to this division of bad faith versus good faith, on the bad faith side, we have people who are vulnerable to Russian propaganda and who believe that, you know, Russia is the bastion of conservative values, and they think that, you know, we need to make sure that this kind of space continues to thrive. Those people aren't interested in what the truth actually is. They're interested in provocative arguments. They're interested in just kind of like poking the bear with a stick. Another kind of bad faith argument that we hear a lot is about oversight of aid to Ukraine. So members of Congress sometimes will ask us, you know, how can I possibly vote yes on this bill to send aid to Ukraine if we don't have a detailed list of where everything is going? We don't. Our assessment is that that is not a good faith argument. People are not actually interested in whether or not such a list exists. And this is frustrating because it puts Ukraine in a very difficult position. On the one hand, Ukraine has to have a list of where everything is going, but not because somebody in America who's asking for it actually cares. So it's extremely painful that Ukraine has to act on such a terrible reason, even though the person who's asking for it isn't actually interested. So, for example, the United States executive branch has multiple inspectors general. I'm not sure how you translate inspectors general, but it's kind of like it's within each executive agency, there's like an oversight and auditing department, and that's called the Office of the Inspector General. And they are the ones who are in charge of making sure that everything within that department or that agency goes to where it's supposed to. So there's three main inspectors general whose teams are working on making sure the Ukraine aid goes to where it needs to. And they publish extremely lengthy reports. The DoD Inspector General, I think his name is Storch. Mr. Storch has published like hundreds of pages of reports of where everything is going. And we bring it to congressional offices and we put it on the table or we send them the file, and they're like, oh, okay, but like, is the stuff going to where it needs to? They don't even open the document. And so it's an extremely frustrating space because it's a bad faith argument. They don't care what the answer is, and they're going to oppose aid to Ukraine because they already previously were opposed to it. And there's not much we can do about that besides eliminating the excuses. On the good faith arguments side, that's a little bit more complicated. So, for example, we have some people who are asking whether or not it is just a good use of American funds for us to be prioritizing seeking a victory in Eastern Europe when we have what they perceive to be an invasion across the southern border. For them, like, these people genuinely believe that. Some of the bad faith arguments have to do with the southern border as well, of course, but there are a lot of people who are 100% genuinely, seriously convinced that the southern border of the United States to Mexico and the people who are coming across are an existential threat to the United States. There are people who genuinely and actually believe that. And so they have to decide whether they're going to prioritize their tax dollars going to a victory in Eastern Europe or a victory in the United States against this existential invasion. Make of that what you will. You know, but these people, they genuinely think that that's the case, and they have to make that decision.
You've been watching a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukraine in Flames. In the description under this video, you can find information on how you can help Ukraine fight Russian aggression. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video. Slava Ukraini!